on the Renaissance, the one on Shakespeare, the 2 crash course videos, and there's another about art, right? Baroque art. So, what contributed to the rise of the Italian city-states during the Renaissance? Well, the Renaissance began in the late 14th century, about 1350, and it spread throughout Europe. But the hub where it all started, where it was the most influential, was Italy and Italy's trade cities. Okay? So Italy was in the perfect position to do really well with trade. They had coastal cities, they had inland cities, and they were able to get trade via the sea or via land. So this became really important because the people that they were trading with would experience these cities and then go home, and they would bring back with them some of the philosophy, some of the art, some of the they would talk about the architecture, they would talk about the culture. So the rise of the Italian states, a big part of it was urbanization. You guys learned during the medieval section about like the manor areas, right? They were like the small little villages and cities. So all of a sudden we go from that, where it's pretty much farm villages, to urbanized cities where there's a heck of a lot more people and they're all trading or working, most of them anyway. So like I said, there was a lot of flourishing trade with all these other countries. What's up?
May I take a photo with my phone? I don't speak English.
No, I know. There's can we unlock that one for her, or
Yeah.
there's a PowerPoint PDF on there for you. She's gonna open it. So there was a lot of trade, and people interacting, culture spreading, and a lot of these ideas and these concepts of this culture went from being in, yeah.
I can't see that part.
Okay. Do you want to go sit in the back seat there? Will that be better for you?
All the way at the back.
You get your seat.
Oh no, I was. Or even when I said that's fine.
You just said it's fine.
All right. The PDF. We're going to put the PDF on Schoology too. So anything that you can't see right now, you'll be able to look at it on your. Okay. All right. So the idea spread, and from this tiny area in Italy, it ends up spreading all over a lot of Europe. So you can see the trade routes here. So you have Rome, you have Florence, Venice, and Milan, and you see their trade coming in, different routes from the sea, and you also have different routes coming in from the land too. So these 3 cities end up becoming the hubs and the most influential parts of Italy. So like I said, Milan, Venice, and Florence, right? And each one of them were a city-state. So what is a city-state? A city-state is essentially like if Tampa was its own state. They have their own rules, they have their own government, and they controlled their own territory. They served as, their government served as leaders of politics, economics, and the cultural life within the territory. So in Milan, there was the Visconti and the Sforza dynasties. In Venice, it was pretty much run by wealthy merchants. And then in Florence, it was controlled for the most part by the Medici family. Anybody have any questions? No? All right. So this is what Milan looked like during the Renaissance. Huge walls around the perimeter, moats, which bring in water, but also service protection, right? You have farms on the outside perimeters to bring in agriculture to the traders that are inside. lots of housing. Venice, very similar thing. Venice is kind of, the floating city. Lots of trade by sea. Florence is kind of a mix of the two. Very big, very large, very urbanized areas with a lot of trade and a lot of services to offer. So there were challenges to being a city-state, right? Because now think if Tampa was its own little country, essentially, with its own little government, wouldn't it be easily overpowered by another country, right? So all these city-states, they were prosperous, they had a lot of money, their culture was booming, and countries like France and Spain were like, we want to get on this. We're going to take over and we're going to take control. So that ultimately led to the fall of a lot of these city-states, but in Florence, they had a lot of specific challenges. Their biggest trade, their biggest creation was they made cloth. So in other countries started producing cloth too, so they lost out on that money. Then the Medici family, who was ruling Florence, was exiled because a guy named Savonarola convinced everybody that they were corrupt, they didn't know what they were doing, he could do better. So he took over and they made a ton of rules, like no one could drink, no one could gamble, tons of restrictions that made everybody pretty unhappy. And he started criticizing the Pope and saying that the Pope was corrupt. So what did the Pope do? The Pope had him exiled. The Pope didn't have him exiled. The Pope had him executed. And when he died, the Medici family came out of exile and took over Florence again. So Machiavelli, he wrote a book called The Prince. And it was this book about political power, and it was like the first writing of its time, right? So essentially what he believed was the ends justify the means. So you don't have to be a good person. You don't have to do right by people. You don't have to treat people right necessarily. You just have to get what you want and get it done. Right? So this is totally different than everything that everybody had been taught. Everybody had been taught, do the right thing, do right by God, do right by the commandments, right? It was a very religious time. And so he believed that it was better to be feared than to be loved. So he also believed that people were self-interested, so he believed that people were selfish and unreliable. So why would he, in politics, why should anybody think about other people if other people aren't thinking about them? That was his kind of philosophy. So to counter that, there was...
Hello, Mr. or Mrs. Sabin. Sorry, Mr. Sabin.
Yes.
Do you have Josiah Castillo?
Is Josiah here?
He's not here?
Is he here? No, he's absent.
Say that again?
He is not here.
Hang on.
He's not here. Okay.
So this guy's name is Castiglione. He wrote a book that was totally the opposite.
Mr. Sabin?
Yeah, he is not here.
He's not here.
Correct.
All right, thank you.
Okay, start again. So he wrote a book that was totally the opposite of what Machiavelli said. Castiglione was like, I'm going to write this book. It's going to be about the perfect nobles. It's going to be about people that have character and grace and talent, people that have educated themselves, people that are interested in art. He believed in self-improvement, in doing right by other people, by having moral awareness, by being self-aware and reflecting, right? So that's totally opposite of what Machiavelli said. So, just like I said, how did Castiglione's view of the ruling class differ from Machiavelli's? Somebody give me an answer. I just said it.
You wrote the perfect example, which is the opposite of Machiavelli.
Okay. Yeah. To elaborate that a little more, just so everybody gets this in your head. Machiavelli believed the ends justified the means. Morals didn't matter. Castiglione believed morals were very important and that you should do right by people. So those are the two things that you need to remember comparing these people, okay? Alright, so the social structure of the Renaissance wasn't too much different than what you guys learned about the medieval period. You had the king, and then, but, you know, in these cities you had the clergy, you had nobility, and you had townspeople, which were the peasants. And the nobility kind of ran the show. They served as advisors to the king and sometimes to the clergy, and they kind of set the rules for the city. And the peasants were the majority of the population. A lot of the serfs, the indentured servants or slaves of the medieval era, had a lot of them had become free. And so this led to a rise in urban poverty because there are only so many jobs in these cities. All right. So the hierarchy within these cities was the patricians, which were like the business moguls, right? They didn't just own one shop. They didn't just own one one guild. They owned multiple businesses. They were bankers and they were industry leaders. Then you had the burghers, and they were like the blacksmiths. They owned their own shop, but they had employees. Then you had the workers, and they worked for a low wage. And then you had the unemployed, who obviously didn't work. So that was the city hierarchy. Now let's talk about family hierarchy within the homes, right? So all marriages were arranged, and in your textbook you'll see that it was typically, teenage girls being arranged to be married to 34-year-old men. Because money was exchanged, dowry, right? So the daughter, a father would pick a husband for the daughter, they would pay money, it was the whole thing. The father was the head of the household, and that meant legally too. And the mother supervised the household and raised the children. So when I say that the father had absolute authority, like legal authority, even if the daughter was considered an adult, it was no longer a child, if she wasn't married, she was under the father's control. Sometimes even if she was married, she was still under the father's control. So let's go more into the culture, now that we've established like what life was like, right? So with this shift out of the medieval age and the Middle Ages, culture changed a lot. It was no longer, everything wasn't looked at as religion, right? It wasn't the main focus of everyone's life. And the concept of like being an individual person became a thing. So humanism is what developed in the Renaissance, and that's essentially a movement that showed a renewed interest in classic, ancient Greek and Roman studies, right? It showed interest in what it was to be human, not necessarily what it was to be religious. They studied ancient Greek and Roman classic works, literature. They started studying humanities subjects like philosophy and history. It wasn't just about religion and theology anymore. And they shifted and began really appreciating these ancient writers, these poets and these philosophers. So, how did humanism impact Italy's Renaissance, right? So this is the father of the Renaissance, Francesco Patriarch. He's the one that started the whole movement of actually relearning and reteaching pure original Latin, which is what the Greeks and the Romans used. He searched for forgotten manuscripts, searched for literature, and he reintroduced a lot of these works and a lot of these authors, these philosophers, into their modern culture. But so this was the start of humanism, and he and the early humanists believed that they should live an intellectual life of solitude. So they should be by themselves, studying and reading and getting more knowledgeable, not actually being out in society. So humanists evolved. They became more involved in their cities and in their communities. A lot of them took jobs working in government, but not as government officials, working as secretaries and clerks. That way they could interact with people and be a part of their communities and still learn and grow. They were heavily influenced by the Byzantines and by Islamic scholars, because the Byzantines and the Islamic scholars had a lot of these ancient Greek and Roman works, like their literature, and knew a lot about their culture because it had kind of entwined with theirs. They pushed working on the humanities, like I said before, philosophy, history, stuff like that. Anything that was outside of religion, they kind of wanted people to be more well-rounded in that aspect. Anybody have any questions? So Johannes Gutenberg, he really changed the game, and I know that it sounds silly to think so long ago, right? But he created the first European mechanized printing press. So all of a sudden it went from only nobles being able to get handwritten literature and handwritten documents to someone who was able to mass produce books and literature for the first time. And common people, townspeople, were learning to read so that they could read books because now they had access to books. All right, so because Johannes Gutenberg created a way for books to be more accessible, you had authors that were actually writing in language that common people could understand. So vernacular is the language of everyday speech in a particular region. So it's the language, think of it as the language of the common people, is vernacular, right? So now, like I said earlier, humanists were really interested in the original Latin and the ancient Latin and stuff, right? But the Renaissance also established this common literature for common people. So two very important authors, philosophers of the time are Dante. You may have heard of Dante's Inferno. It's like this old book. So that's a part of the Divine Comedy that he wrote. And it's essentially about, it's poetry, but not like, rhymey poetry. It's poetry about the soul's path to paradise, to heaven. Christine de Pizan, she actually I mean, for the time, it was very revolutionary. She wrote a book called The Book of the City Ladies. And it was a book pretty much saying women can learn to read and write. Women should be able to learn. Women should be able to go to school. Women have the capacity for knowledge. And women can do other things too. Women can work with their hands and do trades. They don't just have to sit home and manage their households, which at the time was very revolutionary because women weren't educated. So this goes into Renaissance education. Like I said before, it wasn't just religious education anymore. It wasn't just nobles and elites and the royalty being educated. This humanism created a much broader secular, right, so non-religion based education system with liberal studies. So like I said, humanities, which are philosophy and history and things of that nature, mathematics, stuff like that. And not only that, they prepared them for life and for citizenship. It wasn't about being a royal. It wasn't about being a noble. It was about living in your world and in your community. Does anybody have any questions? No? Alright. So, when it comes to Renaissance art, I think we've all heard of Da Vinci, Raphael, or Michelangelo. You've heard of at least one of them, I'm sure. The Mona Lisa, the Statue of David, things like that. Humanism influenced art because it went from everything being kind of dark tones and religious to all of a sudden these artists experimenting with nature and the human form and like organic styles of art, right? So this is Raphael's School of Athens. And you can see it's very colorful, it's very vibrant. It's not religious, it's philosophers all theorizing about the
Please
universe.
excuse this interruption. At this time, please send freshmen through juniors with last names beginning with N through Q to the auditorium for photos. That's N through Q. Thank you.
N-O-P-Q. Yeah. So these are works by Michelangelo. That one is the David. It's one of the most well-known pieces of Renaissance art. And this was all hand-carved, no, mechanical machinery, no mechanical tools. He carved all of this by hand, which even today would be incredible. So because of this change in art in Italy, like I said, people are trading, right? So the culture and the art from Italy are being pushed up north into, England and things like that. So you have a change in their art as well. So they also drift a little bit away from religious. It's still more religious than, classically religious than the Italian art, but they emphasize more on perspective and realistic details versus the Italian Renaissance art was more about human form and nature and organic stuff. And there was less sculptures too. There was more sculptures in Italy than there was in other parts of the world during this time. So Jan van Eyck, this is one of his paintings. So you can see how this differs from the School of Athens, right? This is darker. It's a little bit richer. There's a lot more details. The perspective is kind of forced. And it's a little religious, right? Whereas School of Athens wasn't religious at all. So you have some sort of benevolent being, an angel perhaps. So you could see the differences, that there was definitely changes, but they're not the same at all. So with art and culture comes architecture. So they brought back a lot of the Greek and Roman architecture, domes, columns, clean lines, emphasis on, they emphasize symmetry and proportion, and again with the humanist impact of human form, they made everything kind of had symmetry and had to make sense for the people. So to summarize, the Renaissance was a rebirth. It was a rebirth, right? So we had after, you know, there's phases of Europe, obviously, but they're kind of recreating the past with ancient Romans, but making them new again. Kind of like how people do today when you have people fixing up houses built in the early 1900s. We see I don't know if any of you pay attention to like home decor trends, but we're getting dark wallpapers and rich colors in houses, which for a long time that has not been trendy, but that was the trend 100 years ago. So that's something that happens in culture, and it was something that happened very much in the Renaissance. And a lot of the things that happened during this time, and a lot of the things that were invented during this time, and the philosophy has definitely shaped our world, right? Because we see ourselves as individuals. So, any questions? No? All right. So, on a separate piece of paper or on a separate Word document, you guys are going to answer the following questions with at least 2 sentences for each question, okay? And these are questions that we talked about throughout the lesson that I asked you guys. What contributed to the rise of the Italian city-states during the Renaissance? How did Castiglione's view of the ruling class differ from Machiavelli's? How did humanism impact Italy during the Renaissance? And what was the key difference between Northern European art and Italian art during the Renaissance? Okay? If you write it on paper, put your name at the top, the questions themselves, and stick them in that bluish green basket there. If you do it online, there is a section for you guys to submit it, and also submit your notes, because you'll get points for both of these today. Okay? If anybody has any questions or needs any clarification, I can come to your desk. Otherwise, get ready. Yes?
You said 2 sentences for all 4.
At least 2 sentences for all 4, yep.